Thank you, Luc. Is this okay? Can you hear me in the back? Because I just wanted to know my voice doesn't carry very well, so please let me know if there's, if it doesn't carry, and I will let you know. Sure, I'm going to talk more about social media in a little bit, but we'll start with mainstream media. And this is, you can't read this text. Can you actually read it? Because it's quite light on the slide. Is there any way we can change that? Or is it just the light fall that comes in from here? Well, you can't read the Dutch text anyway, I assume. So I'm going to translate that for you anyway. I'm not going to translate it. But let me start with this. It was just recently, last December, that the Dutch government, they implemented a new nitrogen policy. And that was forcing farmers in the Netherlands to sharply reduce their nitrogen emissions. Now, farmers, according to the evidence-based policy, are responsible for almost 46% of these emissions in the Netherlands. So it's quite, it's almost half. And that, of course, they started to protest that in last fall, and this culminated in a full day of protests on December 18th of last year, a couple of months ago. Now, what happened that day? And I think it's just illustrative of, the kind of thing that I'm going to talk to you about. First thing in the morning, the farmers went to the National Institute for Public Health and the Environment. They're currently working on the coronavirus, but in the month of December, they were just working on nitrogen policy. And that is the institute actually responsible for accounting figures on nitrogen emissions. So the farmers, here you see them, they took their tractors to the RIVM, which is the Dutch acronym for that institute. The farmers actually did not dispute the outcomes or the facts, but the methods deployed by scientists. So in fact, they questioned the scientists' expertise. The next thing they did is they went, and you see the iconic building in the back, the farmers went to the National Public Broadcast Service. It's a very iconic building, and they parked their tractors in front of that building. They were actually squatting the field in front of the NOS, this is the Dutch acronym for the National Public Broadcast Service, and they demanded 2 minutes of airtime on television. I talked to the editor-in-chief that very same day. I happened to run into her, and she said, this was really weird. I had to negotiate with, a number of farmers who argued that they'd actually demanded 2 minutes of airtime on national public television, on prime time. But of course we refused. And she found herself actually explaining their editorial policy. She said, I insist on that we are an independent institution, of course, and we would never give there wouldn't be any reason we would give airtime neither to a government or to any action committee, right? So that's their editorial policy. So the farmers they were very angry, and they called them fake news. Now you see that on the right side, NOS is fake news, which is pretty much an imitation of Trump calling CNN fake news. But this man has actually started to distribute buttons in the Netherlands with NOS is fake news. This was still the very same day. Next, when I was in the afternoon, the farmers took their protests to the Malieveld, and they took their tractors in front of the government. You see the government buildings in the back, where they had protested many times before. So this wasn't the first time they were actually at that spot. But it was interesting that was their third location to park their tractors. And they demanded that the politicians would actually, of course, lower their standards for nitrogen reduction. And that, of course, was the demand they put in for politicians. Now, and here you can see this is a YouTube video, because as an antidote to the fake news that they had just been protesting, where they didn't get any airtime, so as an antidote to the mainstream news, farmers started to invest heavily in distributing their own clips on YouTube and Twitter and other channels. But this happened to be their clip on YouTube. So, in fact, social media channels allowed them to communicate their own commentaries, their own news, their own view on nitrogen policy. And in that way, they could circumvent the mainstream media. It really became their own way of sort of circumventing that institution and the mainstream media filters that wouldn't grant them any airtime anyway. So what happened with, on this single day, it's sort of an emblem of how, it's very emblematic for how the protests were actually taking on institutions. They were disputing their trust in institutions. The farmers' protest, I think, in the Netherlands, they represent that tendency to dispute trust in institutional trust. But it's a very entangled narrative, an entangled narrative that sort of ties together trust in science, in media, in government, sort of also in politics and in the courts. Of course, it demonstrates a certain diminished trust in institution, not just in science and mainstream media, but also in government. And in fact, they were taking on all kinds of democratic institutions, and they were sort of pulling them together as, one type of institutional distrust. Now, the farmers' strategy was really to sow distrust. NOS is fake news, and the RIVM, the institute, is the mouthpiece of the government. Those were the slogans that they used. But the populist far-right party in the Netherlands, Forum for Democracy, that very same day, they went much further than that, and they actually questioned on television, or in a commentary on television, the independence of the court, which had ruled in the nitrogen case. So also, the independent courts became part of that entangled narrative. Now, it will be we'll go too far to sort of talk about all these institutions, and that won't be my focus of today, but I will focus today on the relation between science, media, and the role that social media plays in sowing distrust or actually establishing trust in science. I have three questions that I will touch upon today, but they're very broad, so I don't have the illusion that we can actually answer them today. But the first one is, how is trust in science related to trust in mainstream media? The second one pertains to institutional distrust. How do social media actually fuel institutional trust? I will come back to that because I put a big question mark there. And that, of course, leads to the overall question, how can we govern trust in a changing media landscape? Now, what is at stake here is not just eroding trust in scientists, individual scientists who produce knowledge, or in journalists who actually disseminate knowledge about, in this case, nitrogen. The stakes, I think, are much higher than that. For the problem pertains to the very complex ways in which institutional trust is currently challenged in our society. So that is the kind of problem, the higher stakes that I would like to get to. Now let me start with the first question. How is trust in science related to trust in media? This is almost like a rhetorical question because I can't get into the details, but it's very important to point out the, not so much the differences, but the similarities between the two institutions. These two, science and mainstream media, of course, are very different in terms of professional governance. Science is mostly public, in its institutional incarnation, and news media is mostly private. Well, we do have public media, of course, but it's, a relatively small part of the entire mainstream media landscape. But nevertheless, I would like to point out that they have a few things in common, and those things are very relevant for the argument we would like to pursue here. Starting with trust in science and trust in scientists, when I was still the president of the Royal Academy of Science, we really invested in this issue because we, even 6 years ago, as much as 6 years ago, the issue of trust turned out to be a very, very important thing with the public. And we actually brought out an advisory report. This is literally Trust in Science, which argues that trust is actually based on 4 pillars. And there you see them: integrity, transparency, independence, and accountability. In the report, you will find 4 chapters on each of these pillars of trust. Now, of course, scientists, individual scientists or scholars, they're no arbiters of truth. They're not individuals that tell you this is fact, this is no fact. We actually trust their judgment because they're part of an independent institution, which processes are made transparent and whose professionals can be held accountable to the public, right? That is part of their institutional trust. And at the core, I think, of the current crisis is not just trust in expertise or in the experts that we're supposed to trust, but in their collective definition of what counts as expertise, as trust in expertise. So how does that work? And this is like, a scheme that I made up. This is sort of a ludicrous, very simple-minded sort of summary of what I think happens in science. But what we do in institutional contexts is, of course, we have research lead to discussion, which may lead to consensus. I actually started to rethink this scheme when I was just listening to David Farrell, but that may come up later as a question, which, is ideally leading to common ground, common facts or common evidence that we all want to believe in. Now, many policy decisions, of course, are grounded in this type of consensual, coming to a certain common ground. When, for instance, after decades of scientific debate, there's a consensus of 97% among climate change experts or climate experts on human-induced causes of melting ice caps in the North Pole, this informs and justifies a comprehensive climate agreement, right? So that's how we come to a consensus, and on the basis of that consensus, we build policy. Now, of course, there are many subjects in science that, on which we have no consensus or no consensus yet, or where research is still tentative, because we need room for experiment, we need room for dissensus, for discussion, for still lacking a sort of common ground. And this, of course, creates uncertainty. But without that experiment, without that consensual room, of course, we would never gain common ground, right? So it's an essential part of that consensual project. But that striving for common ground is a profound value in democratic societies. Now, you can dispute facts as outcome, but disputing trust in institutions and their processes, particularly their processes, undermines the conditions for establishing common ground. So that is why I would like to focus on those grounds for establishing, institutional trust. Now, we could debate on that topic for hours, but I want to go to trust in media. And this particularly pertains to mainstream media, but it may not be a coincidence that trust in media as a societal institution rests on much of the same pillars as trust in science. Integrity, transparency, independence, and accountability. And just like science, traditional media tend to rely on a system of institutional checks and balances, right? So in mainstream media, there's still, as of today, we insist on distinguishing facts from opinions, advertising from news, weighing contrasting views and juxtaposing them, and of course presenting outcomes based on the rationality of sound arguments. Those are all ingredients, whether you agree with them or not, but those are the ingredients of institutional mainstream media trying to come to a common sense. And trusted news facts are in fact anchored in those processes of fact-checking, of invoking expertise. And that, of course, is the basis of trying to create common sense and common ground, which is also very much the basis of mainstream media in its institutional sense. And therefore, calling an organization, a news organization, fake news is, in fact, an attack on the pillars of that of institutional integrity. And that is why it may be worse, particularly President Trump calling any news organization fake news rather than him disputing facts. And that brings me back to my example of the farmers who were not so much disputing the facts, but actually calling that organization a fake news organization. Now let's go to social media, because over the past few years, the rapid rise of online media, and particularly social media networks, that created a new dynamic between citizens and institutions, and basically between, also between science and media. So the focus of that public debate, shifted from traditional media to online media, and particularly networks like YouTube, like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so forth, lots of network blogs. And along with this media transformation, one can also perceive a political shift. And I would like to juxtapose those shifts because their entwinement is really important. And particularly since 2016, what we're seeing is that the discourse of rational evidence and logical reasoning, of common ground and common sense, has increasingly given rise to a polarized emotional dispute that promotes confusion, bewilderment, and particularly likes to emphasize that part of uncertainty, that we're still want to be part of science. That's the part where consensus needs to give way to discussion. And that, of course, is a strategy to emphasize that. I'll return to that a little later. Now let's come to this question. Do social media indeed fuel institutional distrust? This shift to social online media and political polarization, I think, has coincided with particularly attacks on institutional trusts in science and media. So over the past 2 years, this question, do social media fuel institutional trust, I think has been emphasized more and more. And it's a question that is triggered by the debate on, that you all know, fake news and disinformation, which is much larger. I'm trying to narrow it down here because if we go into fake news and disinformation, we will be talking for at least 3 more days. But actually, this question that I put here is way too simple. It not only runs the risk of technological determinism, social media, in fact, causing institutional distrust, which is not a sort of a ludicrous argument, but it also misses, I think, the underlying complexity that comes along with understanding institutional trust and distrust. So you may also ask this question the other way around. Does institutional distrust weaponize social media, right? So there's a mutual shaping of science, technology, and society in this sense. And therefore, I think we need to unpack this interrelated, what I call an entangled narrative of a set of arguments that helps explain what is happening, what we're currently facing. And we propose actually 5 different viewpoints, very different disciplinary viewpoints, to look at this institutional trust question in relation to social media. So I will come to each of these points, but they're socio-technical, psychological, political, economic, and social. And I think you can't really approach this complex issue without looking at it from various disciplinary backgrounds. But let me start with just a few examples. Looking at this, you look at, of course, you all know the internet changed very much the relationship between experts and laypersons. In fact, it allowed, the use of social media allowed every single citizen or organization to generate and to publish and to disseminate information, right? Look at this example, which is taken from Health Impact News. Any one of you who knows this blog? It's really difficult to see what the source is, right? It looks like a trustworthy sort of scientific source, and yet it's very, very difficult to evaluate this source integrity. It's almost impossible to verify the source's independence or accuracy due to a lack of context. You can't see what is, how to authenticate this source. You can't see where it was published. And this is what happens a lot on social media. We sort of, and that is what we call context collapse, we lose the context of authenticating sources. Now, this is not a fault, on social media, but this is what happens when users look at the news feed or their stream of different information sources, not really bothering about, whether to track those sources. So, in fact, all content on the internet has sort of become equal because context is increasingly absent as a marker, and we sort of start to accept that we no longer look for context, we just look for content. Everything is called content on the web. A second explanation for the undermining of institutional trust requires us to look not at the technology, but at the behavior of human users of social media. And there have been mass psychology studies now that have looked at how people respond to different kinds of news. very often unconsciously, so they don't know that they're doing this. This was a recent study in Science, it was published last year, and it revealed that social media users pay more attention to misinformation than they do to true items. And this was like a large-scale study that established that. Moreover, I think what is even worse, many users let themselves be led by their prior knowledge of, or prejudice, whatever you call it, in assessing the value of a message. And this is a very well-known subject in mass psychology called confirmation bias or cognitive bias. So, this is very well established in psychology. Now, what social media do, and this is where social media again come in as a technology, is they take advantage of this, this sort of confirmation bias or cognitive bias attitude by inserting buttons like the retweets, the share options, all the fast food options that you have on social media. So you're very easily seduced to click, to forward it to your human friends, and that sort of exploits the human condition to spread stuff that you already know and that you really want to disseminate. And a second explanation that ties in with the former one is what we call emotional contagion. Emotional contagion, for those of you who have not encountered that, is the phenomenon of having one person's emotions and related behaviors directly trigger similar emotions and behaviors in other people, right? So emotions, in fact, have always played an important role in mass media. We all know that phenomenon, right? So that's nothing new. But in social media, massive sharing of particularly personalized messages actually enhance that. They trigger that they increases that impact. So in 2014, which is now 6 years ago, but it didn't get much of a follow-up, it became widely known that Facebook particularly has extensively done research on more than 1 million users. And what they do is they sort of filter positive or negative emotional content in their news feeds. And we now know for a fact that Facebook is constantly using actually that phenomenon of emotional contagion to actually, work on personalized distribution of messages. So they actively use this phenomenon to weaponize more or less or fuel what is being used in social media. A third explanation is sort of a political argument, and now we come to the question of polarization. I think Susan just asked this with David Farrell. It was on top of my mind when I started listening to his speech. Polarization push is a very, sort of political argument. And here's an example from the New York Times. This, I think, was in 2017, just 3 years ago, that climate change denialists claimed that polar bear populations do not at all decline as a result of climate change. That was at one moment spread across social media. But their strategy was to widely and rapidly disseminate a single disputable source in an effort to actually discredit all climate scientists. So this was really, this happened literally, that in social media, the whole debate about climate change was sort of equally distributed between climate scientists who disagreed with the 97% of consensus within climate change, and that sort of polarized the dispute, and that happened mostly on social media. Here the New York Times, of course, being a mainstream source, tried to rectify that dispute. But this was this took about a year, and now it says scientists are pushing back. Now, those kind of polarizing tendencies, I think they tend to be enhanced through social media channels. So, in fact, Facebook, or for that matter, YouTube, we'll get to YouTube a little later, but they do not discriminate between reputable or disputable sources for its all content. It's all content that can be distributed and disseminated. So in fact, scientists, what they're doing, they're fighting back, of course, they're pushing back by fact-checking and going back to sort of common sense arguments. So what they're trying to do basically is to convince denialists by using rational arguments. Whether that works or not, we'll come back to. First, a fourth view from which we need to look at social media, and that is of course, the economic perspective. Social media platforms' primary concern is not so much whether things are factual or things are true, but it is basically their mission is to sell advertisers to users, and mostly by using personalized methods to do that. And this is what we call monetization needs. So, by giving individual users exactly the kind of information to which they are receptive, using confirmation bias, which I just explained, platforms, they generate more clicks, more attention, and of course, more revenue. So a widely spread practice in social media is, of course, the use of bots. And there you see the article on the right. This was in The Guardian just last week. 25% of all tweets about the climate crisis on Twitter is produced by bots. So it's not produced and disseminated by humans, but it's bot-induced and bot-distributed. Here's another example from YouTube. Of course, YouTube being the major distributor of climate change denial. Here you see YouTube's top related videos have a climate change denial problem. Now you probably know that automated mechanism in YouTube. When you start looking at something, you get the top rated videos, right, on your right hand side. And that sort of takes you into a confirmation bias. If you look at climate change denial videos, which are, of course, distributed on YouTube, then you get to more climate change denial videos, and that is what causes this problem. Avaz, they did some research into that, why YouTube is broadcasting climate misinformation to millions. This just came out in January of this year. And this is a real problem for YouTube, I think, because this has been proven now by many different researchers on many different topics. And this is what their recommendation systems actually do. They confirm, they're not only using confirmation bias, but they're actually pushing that in their very systems. And the algorithms that do that are completely opaque. They're so complex that for ordinary people it's very, almost impossible to understand what they're doing. In fact, what social media companies are realizing right now is that they need to install trust in order to hold users' attention. So they're somehow becoming aware of their mechanisms being, somewhat screwed. Now, before we get to that, my last argument is what I would call institutional erosion. And this is not so much erosion as a combination of evasion and corrosion, which I ended up calling erosion. Digital platforms, for one thing, in the various sectors that we're using them, they're bypassing or circumvening established or institutionalized organizations. So Facebook, for instance, says, hey, we're not a media company. We distribute, they're actually responsible for distributing more than 50% of all news in the United States and pretty much that much in Europe. But they sort of withdraw from assuming responsibility for that. So they're saying, we're not a media company. We're not in the business of media. We are an information platform. Same for YouTube, which is owned by Google, of course. Hey, we're not a media company. The only thing we're a platform that brings together advertisers, content, and users. That's all we do. So what they do, in fact, is indeed they go straight from mediatized, these platforms, they go straight from citizens, from senders to citizens without that intermediate filter. But that is not as innocent as of course, you may think, because their techno-algorithmic infrastructure that is built in the middle between, content producers and content consumers, it creates basically its own procedure. It's creating a black box that is not transparent, is not independent, it's not, accountable, right? So that is where institutional trust is sort of turned into a black box in social media. And therefore, I think what they're doing is to help corrode institutional trust by first undermining the rules for integrity, transparency, and accountability, and instead refusing to install a sort of new algorithmic trust that is based on those pillars. So that is a new area for us to look into. Now let's get to the last question. we can govern trust in a changing media landscape. And the 5 arguments, the various interdisciplinary arguments that I just mentioned, of course they create that complex new dynamic between institutional trust and, in this case, the new kid on the block, social media. In our project, and we're going to be a work package in this project, so I didn't really explain that, but we will get to that a little later. We are going to focus on how to establish trust in a changing media landscape, because that media landscape has sort of undermined or at least challenged the conventional relations and the conventional pillars of trust that we were so used to. I'm not saying that they were all, the best standards we ever had. I'm not saying that they were the best institutional anchors for social trust. But we have now, a new type of kid on the block in that changing media landscape that is even further corroding those institutional anchors. So what I think is at stake here is not just the eroding trust in scientists who produce knowledge or the journalists and citizens who disseminate that knowledge through media, but in fact the stakes are much, much higher than that. Because the problem really pertains to the complex ways in which we anchor trust in our society. So this forces, in fact, conventional institutions to reflect more fundamentally on how trust and transparency can be re-anchored, and that is what we would like to look into. Academics and journalists, they have been looking for counter strategies. For instance, a lot of scientists have gone into systematically rebuking, deceitful stories, outright fabrications, so they started to do a lot of fact-checking. And here, for instance, they do, that fact-checking on climate change. As a remedy, here you can see a lot of scholars went into this fact-checking mechanism, and they tried to rebut a lot of false claims involving climate change, but that, of course, takes up a lot of resources. And it's almost impossible for scientists to do that with, every type of fake news or whatever. So a lot of scientists started doing this in 2017 and 2018, but, in fact, a lot of scholars have now tried to look into automated ways of doing more fact-checking and even developing automated online tools for assessing, for instance, the reliability of sources. But what they do is constantly to bring back that discussion to the rational discourse of, rational arguments, of rational debate, a lot of common sense and common ground issues that they try to build onto. But whereas in social media, what we've been seeing is there's increasingly, that discussion is increasingly weaponized by emotion and not the kind of rational debates that scientists would like to bring into it. So that part, I think, of the emotional contagion deserves a lot more attention. And actually, Doña Alinea, who is sitting here, Doña, there you are, she will look on the impact of emotions in this social media landscape, because we haven't really looked into that. That's a very important, sort of weaponizing means of polarizing that discussion. Scientists took to the streets, you probably remember that, a couple of years ago, and they very visibly and vocally protested the assault on their credibility, right? And I think it was very right that they did so, because they wanted to reclaim their authority. And they did so. If you look at the signs that they're carrying, they refer to their institutional anchors. They were, they say, well, we have, in science we trust, in evidence we trust. So they actually refer to peer review, to evidence-based argumentation, to the actual rules for building trust. But the emotional strategies that are, they're not the home turf of scientists. They're not very used to doing that. They're not much into emotions. So they try to get back that debate to the rational common ground discussion that they're so used to. They want to seek consensus and engage in debate. Now, this is, my last slide, but how should trust be governed? That is the big question that we would like to invest in this project. In that digital platform society that where a lot of sort of new laws for breaking up common ground are working, well, we don't know yet. That is part of the research project that we have accepted and that we want to work on. We have a few suggestions, but those will be the kind of directions we will be looking into. We need to reflect more fundamentally on how social media can be governed, and particularly hold them responsible for establishing common ground. And that's why I was listening so intensely to David, who just explained that, for instance, the deliberative democracy could be part of that common ground seeking. And I think that might be, part of the solution. My question to David would have been, if you would have allowed more time, how would social media figure into those deliberative democracies? Because what often happens is, you start the deliberative process, people start sending Facebook messages, they start sending out tweets, they do retweeting, and in no time, literally within minutes, the whole discussion is sort of thwarted by social media. So I would have liked to ask that question of what's the function of social media in deliberative democracies? Secondly, I think we need to look at those pillars of institutional trust, at integrity, transparency, autonomy, and accountability, who have now sort of, be put in a black box, an algorithmic black box, but we need to unpack them. We need to find out, and I think social media companies are very interested in this, how can we provide more trust? How can we institutionalize trust in the algorithmic black boxes that we have so far sort of kept to ourselves? They're keeping the cards to their chest. And finally, I think we need to look at independent institutions, how they can survive in a fully commoditized system of, in this case, social media, that are completely commercialized. And there, I think we have to we have to reinvest in the common good, right? Because this is really what, I just listened to an interview given by Mark Zuckerberg, who said, this is what we really want to do for the next 5 years. We want to invest in the common good. And this interview was recorded last month, and I thought, okay, Mark Zuckerberg, we are going to invest in the common good. I want to know from you, I want to listen to you, but how can you do that in a fully commoditized environment where there is really no incentive to actually come to, these kinds of markers for common good? Okay, so what we want to do in work package 4 of this PeriTiA project, we want to investigate the changing media landscape that is just, part of a much wider, problem of changing anchors of trust. And that is why we are so much looking forward. We're very excited to work with all of these disciplinary experts on this topic and sort of come to a more deliberative ground for understanding this complex problem. Thanks, Maria.
Yes, you have time. So thank you very much, José. We'll start here. Could you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Meredith Wood. I'm a lecturer here at University and I'm working in personalization, psychology. You gave 5 explanations of the role of social media in trust. I was wondering if you had considered another psychological mechanism. The reason why I'm mentioning this is that on the school grounds, I meet a lot of anti-vaccination people, and that's, I'm not myself an anti-vaxxer, it's spreading, you see it spreading. When I talk to my friends about this, they say they do not trust science, they only trust personal accounts. Yeah. And so what I think, so that's not the only thing I noticed. The other thing I noticed is that there is a pleasure attached to being the only one against the mainstream, or the only drive against the mainstream consensus. Sort of arrogance. It's nice to be arrogant. Yeah. It's a good feeling. So that's.
So could you come to a question, please?
Yes. This is different than what the psychological mechanisms you mentioned, which is emotional contagion and confirmation bias. Nevertheless, it seems to be the main source of the spreading of the information.
I actually did mention it when I was mentioning mass personalization. So the personalization of messages on YouTube and Facebook, they actually contribute very much to this, this phenomenon that you're just mentioning. Actually, by pointing out 5 approaches to the relation between social media and institutional distrust, I'm not saying there are not more. There actually, I think there must be more than 100, and I've encountered like many of them. The only thing is I just wanted to indicate how problematic it is to just, pull out one specific relationship. There are many, but we try to come to, to sort of a categorization of the kind of arguments that you can pull out. Right. So, but I definitely agree on you. It's a very well-known area.
There's a question over on this side here. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. It's not unrelated to the last question, and it regards the relationship between ownership or participation and trust. Because it seems that mainstream media has been modified quite significantly over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
By reporting social media, right? So we often read news articles that say, John in Dublin thinks that climate change doesn't exist, and Mary in Cork thinks that it does, and that's your news article, right? On the BBC,
right.
reporting of tweets.
And Trump tweeted such and such.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
So there seems to be an urge in mainstream media to take on this idea that, well, we're all involved in this discussion, right? Everybody has a stake in it. This is markedly absent from a professional community of scientists, for example. And it seems to me that one of the results of social media is that trust is now no longer merely based on believing in the expertise of an institution, but it's also based on our capacity to own that information. And this is also interestingly played out in a previous paper where a group of citizens are quite happy to take expert advice because they feel they then have ownership of it because they have a stake in the argument. So I'm wondering, what do you think the relationship between participation or ownership and trust is, and how we might use that to get more trust in scientific institutions?
Sorry, could you just identify yourself?
Oh, sorry, my name is Lisa Fornauer with the UCD School of Law.
Okay,
Thanks.
very interesting question. I think we can only begin to answer that question by pointing out that a lot of social media, and that's why I use the word weaponize, is used to sort of attack. You don't think, you just send out, right? And that it goes against the grain of our consensual debate mode of discourse. And that, I think, we need to take back. And that's why I had wanted to ask that question to David Farrell. What happens if people started to weaponize deliberative democracies, deliberative consensual processes? Because this is really sort of the anti-discourse. What social media does is really undermine everything that is sort of long-term, reflective, based on rational exchange of arguments. That is what it does. It's more intent on sending out very short, very brief, emotional messages that comply with the whole discourse of course, this is what you do. You just send tweets and then you retweet that. You don't add anything to turn it into a rational, argumentative discourse. And that is why it is so important to bring that back, to sort of reintegrate social media into that process of consensus making, of consensual debate. Do I know how to do it? I have no clue. That's why I wanted to ask the question to David Farrell. Do I think it's important? Heck yes. And I think part of that responsibility is now with social media producers, with social media institutions. They start to call themselves institutions. Mark Zuckerberg just recently said, well, when Facebook starts to be an institutional force in this society, and I thought, okay. So at that point, you need to start accepting everything that comes along with institutional responsibility, which is also, those markers of transparency, of integrity, of consensus making and debate. So that's, I think, a direction we need to go. We do not want to have two discourses standing in, opposed to each other. We want them to you know, social media is no longer something that is separate from society. It's very much part of our social fabric, and we need to come to understand that and turn it into that responsible part of the social fabric that we know.
Do you have a short question, Shane?
Yes, my name is Shane.
Yeah, we only have a few minutes, so keep it short,
It's
please.
very short. What do you feel are the major implications for our systems of education?
Oh, that's a really long question, and I don't. It's a really long answer, and I don't want this answer to stand in between me and your lunch. So, actually, I've written a chapter on that. I think that in education, social media is playing an incredibly important role right now, not just in teaching kids how to use it and how to, you know, integrate it into their daily lives, but also in social media platforms becoming part of their educational context. And there, I think we need to do a lot of things, you know, and there's a lot of work to be done in media literacy, for instance, but not just that. How can we use social media towards better ends? Now, I know I'm becoming very normative here, but that, I think, is one of the, you know, venues we need to look into. Sorry for being so brief, but...
Well, we can discuss it over
Sure.
lunch maybe. So
Yeah.
thank you very much, José, for this.
You're very welcome.